Jesus washes the feet of the disciples? Let's take a look today on 2:15. All right, John chapter 13, we see as Jesus shares the Last Supper with his disciples and washes their feet. We'll also examine the beginning of some of Jesus' final teachings for his disciples prior to his death. This episode today is actually our 15th episode in the Gospel of John series. So if you haven't seen any of the previous episodes, I'll leave a link in the description. You can check those out, and then we'll take a look here. But let's pick it up today in verse 1 of John 13. Now, before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The Passover was approaching, and Jesus was now within 24 hours of when he would be crucified. With that in mind, we see Jesus' focus has now shifted to his disciples as he prepares them for what was to come, that he would soon depart from the world to return to the Father. All of that said, and in a similar fashion to chapter 11, we see as John emphasizes this tremendous love that Jesus had for his disciples, even as the text states that he loved them to the very end. This phrase in particular, it could be akin to the saying in our modern vernacular that we love someone to the moon and back, or that we love someone to the end of the earth. While Jesus held a love for the entirety of the world, and this love is what compelled him to come to mankind as to what compels him now to proceed even to the cross. He held a special love for these, his disciples, these ones whom he's taught and he's traveled with and he have been his companions this entire time. This love is perhaps in many ways something that makes the impending betrayal of Judas even more impactful. Verse 2. During the supper, the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God, and was going back to God, got up from supper, and laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. So interestingly, John, in the same breath, he points out Judas's betrayal and Jesus's preparing to wash the feet of the disciples. What a tremendous picture of the incarnation of Christ and the gospel. Just as Jesus laid aside his garments and girded himself in a towel to serve, so Jesus had laid aside the glory and splendor of heaven to take on human flesh. He chose to come as a servant, dying in our place, even for the likes of those who would betray him, such as Judas. Furthermore, it's a fascinating reminder that, as the text points out, Jesus knew that the Father had given all things into his hands. Yet his course of action isn't to celebrate or to shout into triumph, but instead to serve these disciples whom he loved. Verse 5. Then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. So he came to Simon Peter. He said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered and said to him, "What I do you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter." Peter said to him, "Never shall you wash my feet." Jesus answered, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Foot washing, it was considered to be one of the lowliest jobs, and it would have been reserved for the lowliest of servants. Yet Jesus, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the creator of the cosmos, he lowered himself to that level, even as the lowliest servant. Moreover, the text states that he poured water into the basin. In this physical illustration, Jesus, he was unwilling to cut any corners. He just as easily could have had all of the elements prepared for him, but rather he took the time to thoroughly display servanthood for the disciples. Peter, however, he protests to the Lord's act of service. He says, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" As if to say, between the two of us, I should be washing your feet. Jesus responds, however, to make an even greater point. He says, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. And we find ourselves in much the same position as Peter. Without allowing the Lord to wash, cleanse, transform, and renew us, we have no part with him. As another point of emphasis, Jesus says, if I do not wash you. You see, we can attempt in our futility to cleanse ourselves by many other means, to atone with our best efforts. But unless the Lord washes us, we have no part with him. Furthermore, we see the point being made that even Peter, one of Jesus' closest companions and most loyal followers, needed to be cleansed. This is the same Peter that stepped out in faith to walk with Jesus on the water. These same feet that Jesus is now washing walked on the water with the Lord, and yet he still needed to be washed by the Lord here. Verse 9. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, he who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. For he knew the one who was betraying him. For this reason he said, not all of you are clean. See, while it was still unclear to Peter what Jesus was accomplishing, he wanted as much of whatever it was as possible, seeking for Jesus to wash not only his feet, but his hands and head as well. Symbolically, the hands and the head also hold meaning as the actions we commit and the motives or the thoughts behind our actions. It's as if Peter is saying, Lord, if you insist on doing this, don't stop at my feet, but wash me thoroughly. If refusing to allow Jesus to wash his feet would exclude him from fellowship with the Lord, he intended to take any measure necessary to be obedient to him and to prevent that from happening. Jesus, however, points out within the illustration that one who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, that not all of those present were clean. And while we shouldn't take this necessarily as a literal recommendation from Jesus in regard to cleanliness, there's a greater meaning and a greater metaphor that's meant here. The Greek words that are being used, they hold an interesting contrast to one another. The word for bathe, it indicates an overall washing of the body, while the word for wash, it indicates a spot cleaning of a given area, in this case, the feet. While his identity hadn't been revealed to the other 11 yet, Judas lacked the total washing to which Jesus referred. Verse 12. So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you also should do as I did to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who is sent greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. So to a degree, this served to point out another way in which Jesus was teaching them by example. Typically, this chore would have been done by a servant as the guests were entering the home. In this case, it seems to have not happened in that manner, yet none of the disciples washed their own feet, nor did they offer to wash the feet of Jesus, let alone the other disciples. Jesus knew the importance of the disciples, that they needed to be as servants to one another, operating in unity. Soon they wouldn't have Jesus in person, and they would truly need to operate in unity with their fellow disciples. Furthermore, he knew of the importance for them to be prepared to act as servants to the world in his absence. Jesus, however, he emphasizes, if you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. It wasn't enough for the disciples to simply have a knowledge or understanding of what Jesus was illustrating. They needed to practice it as well. Verse 18. I do not speak of all of you. I know the ones I have chosen, but it is that the scripture may be fulfilled. He who eats my bread has lifted up his heel against me. From now on, I am telling you before it comes to pass, so that when it does occur, you may believe that I am he. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who receives whomever I send receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. Jesus, even in his calling Judas, was well aware of the betrayal that would come. Yet even knowing this, he still chose to call Judas. This, as Jesus points out, was in fulfillment of prophecy, specifically that of Psalms chapter 41, verse 9, where it says, "Even my close friend, in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." Even in knowing Judas's eventual betrayal, Jesus all along has continued to teach him with the other disciples, delivering the gospel to even this one who would soon turn him over for execution. Verse 21. When Jesus had said this, he became troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Truly, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me." The disciples begin looking at one another, at a loss to know of which one he was speaking. You see, too often we tend to unintentionally, and perhaps even in the back of our mind, box Jesus in as sort of going through the motions of prophecy. However, Jesus' humanity is on full display in relation to Judas's betrayal. The text states here that much like at the tomb of Lazarus, Jesus became troubled in spirit as he spoke to the disciples regarding one of their own that would betray him. He wasn't detached from the weight of this idea, nor was he emotionally absent. He loved Judas just as he loved the other 11 disciples, and so he was troubled in spirit. Verse 23. There was reclining on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. So Simon Peter gestured to him and said to him, "Tell us who it is of whom he is speaking." He, leaning back thus on Jesus' bosom, said to him, "Lord, who is it?" So as mentioned during the introduction study of this series, the author of this gospel account, widely regarded to be John the disciple, he does not refer to himself by name, but by the title, the disciple whom Jesus loved. In this passage, we see this title's first use. And on another note, traditionally meals that were ceremonial in nature, such as the Passover in this case, they were often eaten around a large, low table. The participants would lay on their stomach and left side, often leaning on their left elbow to eat with their right hand. All of this considered, John was apparently to Jesus' right and was close enough to be able to communicate with him discreetly. Verse 26. Jesus then answered, "That is the one for whom I shall dip the morsel and give it to him." So when he had dipped the morsel, he took and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. After the morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore, Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." So the giving of the first morsel, it was a tradition that was reserved for an honored guest. The host would typically, much as Jesus did in this instance, dip a portion of bread and then present it to the guest. This idea holds a few levels of significance. In many ways, Judas, being the one among the 12 who was found to not be truly genuine, he was a guest among brothers. At the same time, Jesus, utilizing this method to indicate to John that Judas was the betrayer, he demonstrated his mercy. In a sense, because of the discreet nature of this signal to John, Jesus was offering Judas one last opportunity to repent of what he had committed to do. Unfortunately, after accepting this morsel from Jesus rather than repenting, at this point, Judas was set on the path he had chosen. Jesus bid him to do what he had planned quickly, as Judas had already made up his mind, and there was no sense in drawing out the process any longer than necessary. Verse 28. Now no one of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose he had said this to him. For some were supposing, because Judas had the money box, that Jesus was saying to him, "Buy the things we have need of for the feast," or else that he should give something to the poor. So after receiving the morsel, he went out immediately, and it was night. See, none of the other disciples, with the apparent exception of John, knew of Judas's treachery. Had they been aware, they undoubtedly would have attempted to stop Judas, even by force if needed. Instead, they assumed that Judas was being sent by Jesus to run an errand, such as buying the things needed for the feast, or to give some money to the poor. But rather, he was going to conspire with the religious leaders for Jesus' betrayal. Verse 31. Therefore, when he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him immediately. Little children, I am with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, now I also say to you, where I am going, you cannot come." You see, to the Roman world at that time, and especially among the Jews, crucifixion was a punishment of humiliation reserved for criminals. Jesus, however, he refers to it in terms of glorification, that he would be glorified by it, and that the Father would be glorified in turn. The trial, torture, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus all served as a pivoting point in the relationship between God and man. Through this, mankind would have an avenue to be reconciled to the Father and to glorify him as a result. Jesus reiterates to the disciples the same phrase that he said to the Jewish leaders, "Where I am going, you cannot come." While for the Jewish leaders, this phrase was used to chastise, for the disciples, Jesus utilizes it to prepare them. Furthermore, he does so with a sense of tenderness, evident through his addressing them as little children. One can sense the concern and care that he has for the disciples. At this point, he is only hours away from death and mere days away from his resurrection. After this, he would ascend to the Father 40 days later, leaving the disciples to carry on his earthly ministry. Verse 34. "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." In this phrase, Jesus, he sums up much of his physical illustration of washing the disciples' feet. Their serving one another was to be motivated by their love for one another, after the example of love that he had shown and would soon show further for them. This love for one another then, as well as today, it served as a testimony to the world of the gospel, not only ministering in words, but actions and attitudes as well. Verse 36. Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus answered, "Where I go, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow later." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you right now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times." Peter continues to misunderstand what Jesus means in regard to the idea, "Where I go, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow later." His insistence is that he would follow Jesus even to death if needed. However, where Peter would fall short by his denial was not that he was unwilling to die for Jesus, but rather that he was unwilling to live for him, even if it meant being mocked or ridiculed. And while Peter would eventually die for his belief in the Lord, the reality is that in order for Peter to die for Jesus, Jesus had to first die for Peter. In John 14, Jesus continues his discourse with the disciples during the Last Supper. Among this discourse, we'll see as Jesus refers to himself as the way, the truth, and the life. Please consider subscribing to stay up to date as new studies are released. And your support of this ministry, it helps to place the gospel in the hands of even more individuals seeking a deeper walk with the Lord. Thanks for watching.